Don't worry, Evelyn, my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral reception as she slid a brochure for low-income senior apartments across the table toward me. We'll make sure you're taken care of. I looked down at the glossy pamphlet resting beside my untouched coffee and ran my fingers slowly across the cheap paper. Maple Grove Assisted Living. Affordable comfort for seniors on a fixed income. Around us, crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the chandeliers of the Whitmore Country Club ballroom, while guests dressed in black cashmere and tailored suits spoke in hushed voices about my late husband, as though he had already become a business headline instead of a man who had slept beside me for 42 years. Charles Whitmore had been dead for exactly 3 days. 3 days since I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand, while snow fell quietly outside the window of St. Andrew's Medical Center. 3 days since the strongest man I had ever known looked at me one final time and whispered, "Don't let them make you feel small after I'm gone." At the time, I thought grief was making him dramatic. Standing there now with Vanessa's brochure in my hand, I realized he had known exactly what was coming. "It's actually a lovely place," Vanessa continued gently, her manicured hand resting against my wrist for just a second too long. "They have transportation services and group dinners and all kinds of activities for seniors." Seniors. The word landed harder than it should have. I was 68 years old, not helpless. But no one in that room seemed to see me as Evelyn Whitmore anymore. To them, I had already become the widow, the burden, the woman they assumed would slowly disappear now that the man with the money was gone. Across the room, my son Daniel stood beside two of Charles's former business partners, nodding along while they discussed estate taxes and market conditions over bourbon that cost more per glass than my father made in a week back in 1968. He avoided looking at me entirely. That hurt more than Vanessa's brochure ever could. I remembered when Daniel was 7 years old and used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms because he believed his father could protect him from anything. Now Charles was gone, and Daniel looked relieved to stand on the other side of the room pretending not to notice how people were speaking to his mother. "You'll probably want to sell the house soon," one of Charles's cousins said as she approached me with the careful expression people reserve for the terminally unfortunate. "A place that size must be impossible financially now." I smiled politely. "I suppose we'll see." She nodded with obvious pity. "Charles handled everything, didn't he?" Before I could answer, Vanessa gave her a sad little smile. Evelyn never really liked dealing with numbers. The two women exchanged the kind of look people use when discussing someone fragile. I said nothing. I simply folded the brochure in half and placed it carefully inside my purse beside the folded document Martin Hale had handed me less than 12 hours earlier in his law office downtown. I had not slept after reading it. $28 million. Charles had quietly transferred everything into an irrevocable trust 6 months before his death. Every account, every investment, every property. Sole control granted to Evelyn Grace Whitmore. Me. But as I stood there listening to people discuss my future like I was some frightened old woman one Social Security check away from losing her electricity, I realized something strange. The money wasn't the part that hurt. It was how quickly they had all decided I was powerless. The funeral reception finally began to thin out around 7:30 that evening. Outside the tall ballroom windows, the February sky had turned the color of wet concrete, and soft snow drifted across the golf course behind the country club. I stood near the coat check holding my black wool gloves while guests offered me the same rehearsed expressions of sympathy they had been repeating for hours. "Charles was a wonderful man. If you need anything, let us know. I cannot imagine what you must be going through." They all sounded kind enough on the surface, but beneath every sentence I heard something else. Curiosity, calculation, speculation about what would happen to me now that Charles Whitmore was no longer standing beside me. Vanessa was near the exit speaking quietly with one of her friends from the junior charity board. I was not trying to overhear them, but my name drifted across the marble foyer before I could walk away. "She is handling it better than I expected," the woman whispered. Vanessa gave a soft laugh. "Honestly, I think she is still in shock. She has no idea how expensive that house is to maintain on her own." I kept my eyes on the falling snow outside the glass doors. "Do you think Daniel will move her somewhere smaller?" the friend asked. Vanessa lowered her voice, but not enough. "Eventually. We are trying to be gentle about it." Gentle. The words settled coldly inside my chest. I thought about the house they were discussing so casually. The Whitmore estate sat on 6 acres outside Hartford with white stone columns, a library Charles designed himself, and gardens I had spent 30 years tending by hand every spring. I knew every creak in the staircase, every stubborn cabinet hinge, every coffee stain Charles ever tried to hide from me in his office. Yet somehow the people standing 20 feet away spoke about my future there, as if I were an aging tenant waiting for instructions. Daniel finally approached me near the entrance with his overcoat folded over one arm. "You ready to head home, Mom?" he asked carefully. "Home." The words sounded strange coming from him now. "In a little while," I said. "I wanted to thank everyone before I leave." He nodded, but his attention drifted almost immediately toward Vanessa across the room. I studied his face quietly. He looked exhausted, older somehow. There were faint gray circles beneath his eyes that reminded me painfully of Charles during his last weeks in the hospital. For a moment, I almost reached for his hand the way I used to when he was little and frightened after nightmares. But something held me back. Grief had not pushed us together. It had exposed the distance that was already there. "Mom," he said after a long pause, "have you thought about what you are going to do next?" There it was. Not how are you sleeping? Not have you eaten? Not are you lonely in that big house without Dad? What are you going to do next? I answered carefully. I have not made any decisions yet. Daniel shifted awkwardly. "Vanessa and I were thinking maybe you should let us help with the finances for a while, just until things settled down." I almost smiled. My son still believed I was standing at the edge of financial ruin, while $28 million sat quietly behind my name downtown in Martin Hale's office safe. "That is thoughtful," I said softly. "But your father made sure everything was handled." Daniel frowned slightly. "Dad always handled investments himself." "Yes," I replied. "He did." I watched confusion flicker across his face for just a second before Vanessa appeared beside him wearing that polished expression she used whenever she wanted control of a conversation. "Evelyn, sweetheart, Daniel and I can come by tomorrow and help sort through Charles's paperwork," she offered warmly. "Insurance forms, bills, account statements. Things can get overwhelming fast." I looked directly into her eyes for the first time all evening. "I'm sure they can," I said. Then I slipped on my gloves, picked up my coat, and walked out into the falling snow before either of them could answer. The house felt wrong without Charles in it. Not empty exactly. Wrong. Like the walls themselves were waiting for him to walk back through the front door, carrying the smell of winter air and cedar aftershave. I unlocked the front entrance just after 8 that night and stood silently in the foyer while the grandfather clock near the staircase ticked through the quiet. 42 years of marriage leaves traces everywhere. His scarf still hung beside mine in the coat closet. His reading glasses sat folded neatly on the library table where he left them before his final hospital stay. Even the kitchen still smelled faintly like the dark roast coffee he made every morning at exactly 6:15. I took off my heels slowly, setting them beside the door, and realized it was the first moment all day I had been completely alone. The funeral guests were gone. The casseroles and sympathy flowers were gone. Vanessa's careful voice was gone. And underneath the silence, another feeling began, settling into place. Awareness. I walked through the house, turning on lamps one by one until warm pools of amber light stretched across the hardwood floors. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the backyard gardens Charles and I planted during our first summer in Connecticut. Back then we could barely afford furniture, but Charles insisted on buying rose bushes because he said beautiful things mattered during hard years. I paused near the dining room doorway and noticed something immediately out of place. One of the drawers in Charles's antique writing desk had been left slightly open. My chest tightened. Charles never left drawers open. Ever. Even during chemotherapy treatments when he was too weak to stand comfortably, he still straightened every stack of paper before bed each night. I crossed the room carefully and pulled the drawer open farther. Inside, folders had been shifted around. Account statements were no longer arranged in their usual order. A small leather notebook Charles kept for personal reminders was missing entirely. I stood there for several seconds staring at the disturbed papers while a cold realization slowly spread through me. Someone had been searching through my husband's things. My first instinct was denial. Maybe Daniel had looked for insurance documents after the hospital called. Maybe Martin Hale needed paperwork. But deep down I already knew. The timing felt too deliberate. Too eager. I closed the drawer quietly and continued upstairs toward our bedroom. Halfway down the hall, I noticed another thing missing. Charles's gold cuff links were gone from the valet tray outside the closet. They were not especially valuable compared to some of his watches or artwork, but Charles wore those cuff links every Christmas Eve for almost 20 years. Vanessa once told him they looked old-fashioned. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed and stared at the dark television screen across from me. Earlier that afternoon, people at the country club had spoken about my future as though I was fragile and dependent. But this was different. This was movement. Planning. The kind people do when they believe ownership is about to change hands. My eyes drifted toward Charles's side of the nightstand where his silver watch rested beside a framed photograph from our anniversary trip to Maine. He had his arm around my shoulders in the picture, smiling into the ocean wind while I laughed at something he said. Looking at that photograph now, I suddenly remembered a conversation from last fall. We had been sitting in this very room after dinner while Charles reviewed paperwork from Martin Hale's office. I teased him for working too much, and he looked up at me with an expression I could not understand at the time. "Promise me something," he said quietly. "If people start acting differently after I am gone, do not rush to explain yourself." I laughed softly back then. "Explain what?" He held my gaze for a moment before answering. "Anything." Sitting there alone in the dim bedroom light, I finally understood what he had been trying to protect me from. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise out of habit. For 42 years, Charles had started every weekday at 6 sharp whether he needed to or not. Even during retirement, his body never forgot the discipline of decades spent building Whitmore Financial Group from a 2-room office into one of the most respected investment firms in New England. I lay still for a moment staring at the pale winter light creeping through the bedroom curtains and listened to the silence beside me. That was the cruelest part of grief. Not the funeral, not the flowers, not the sympathy cards stacked neatly downstairs. It was waking up and forgetting for half a second that the person you loved no longer existed anywhere you could reach. I finally pulled myself out of bed and wrapped my robe tightly around my shoulders before heading downstairs. The kitchen felt colder than usual despite the heat running through the house. I filled the coffee maker automatically, still measuring enough grounds for 2 cups before realizing my mistake halfway through. Old habits survive even when people do not. While the coffee brewed, I noticed movement outside near the driveway. Daniel's black SUV rolled slowly toward the garage just after 7:15. My stomach tightened slightly. He had not called first. A few moments later, the back passenger door opened and Vanessa stepped out holding 2 cardboard coffee carriers and a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She smiled brightly the second I opened the front door. "Good morning, Evelyn," she said in the careful voice people use around patients recovering from surgery. "We thought you might need company." Company. Behind her, Daniel gave me a tired smile before carrying several grocery bags inside without waiting for permission. I stepped aside quietly and watched them move through my kitchen like visitors rehearsing future ownership. Vanessa placed the coffees neatly on the marble island while Daniel began unpacking groceries into my refrigerator. Yogurt, prepackaged salads, microwave soups, low-sodium crackers. The kind of food people buy for someone they assume can no longer take care of themselves properly. "You did not have to do all this," I said calmly. "We know you probably have not been thinking about practical things this week," Vanessa replied gently. "Grief can make everyday tasks overwhelming." I looked at the organized grocery bags lined across my counter and almost admired the strategy behind it. Nothing openly disrespectful. Nothing cruel enough to challenge directly. Just quiet little assumptions stacked carefully on top of one another until the message became impossible to miss. "You are no longer capable." Daniel finally sat across from me at the kitchen table while Vanessa opened her leather portfolio beside him. "Mom," he began cautiously, "we were talking last night, and we think it might help to start organizing some of Dad's financial paperwork now before things pile up." There it was again. Financial paperwork. Not memories. Not mourning. Numbers. Accounts. Property. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and waited. Vanessa slid several printed documents across the table toward me. "This is just a preliminary checklist," she explained smoothly. "Monthly expenses, maintenance costs, insurance renewals, property taxes. Houses this size can become extremely difficult after losing a primary income source." Primary income source. I studied the paper without touching it. According to Vanessa's spreadsheet, Maintaining the Whitmore estate would supposedly become financially unsustainable within 18 months unless major lifestyle adjustments were made. I almost smiled at the absurdity of hearing a woman with a leased Mercedes explain financial collapse to the sole owner of a $28 million trust fund. Daniel leaned forward carefully. We just want to help you avoid getting blindsided later. I looked at my son for a long moment. His voice sounded sincere. That was the hardest part. I no longer knew whether he was being manipulated by Vanessa or whether he had simply become the kind of man who saw vulnerability as an opportunity to take control. Before I could answer, Vanessa reached into her folder again and pulled out a glossy brochure identical to the one from the funeral reception. Maple Grove Senior Residences. No pressure, of course, she said quickly. But there is currently a waiting list, and we thought it might be smart to start planning ahead. I stared at the smiling silver-haired couples printed across the brochure while fresh coffee steamed quietly between us. Then I folded the paper once, placed it carefully back on the table, and asked the first question that made both of them visibly uncomfortable. How long after your father died did you two start discussing where to send me? For a few seconds, nobody answered me. The refrigerator hummed softly behind Daniel, while snow tapped lightly against the kitchen windows, and suddenly the entire room felt painfully small despite the 12-foot ceilings Charles once loved so much. Vanessa recovered first. She always did. Evelyn, that is not fair, she said gently, folding her hands together on the table like someone speaking to a difficult patient. We are only trying to make sure you are protected. Protected. The word almost made me laugh. Charles used to say people reveal themselves fastest when money enters the room, even if nobody says the word out loud. I used to think he sounded cynical. Sitting there across from my son and daughter-in-law, I realized he had simply lived long enough to recognize patterns. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face before speaking. Mom, nobody is trying to get rid of you. I held his gaze calmly. Then why does every conversation suddenly involve where I should live? Neither of them answered immediately. Vanessa glanced toward Daniel before offering another careful smile. Because we are worried about you being alone here. I looked around the kitchen slowly. Morning light spilled across the marble countertops Charles had insisted on importing from Vermont nearly 20 years earlier. Copper pans hung neatly above the stove. Fresh white orchids sat near the sink because Charles replaced them every Friday no matter the cost. This house was not simply property. It was the physical timeline of my entire adult life. I am not afraid of being alone, I said quietly. Vanessa leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that suddenly felt less sympathetic and more strategic. Evelyn, maintaining a property like this costs a fortune every month. Utilities alone are probably close to $4,000 in winter. $4,216, actually. Charles reviewed every monthly statement personally. Even after Martin Hale convinced him years ago that a man worth tens of millions no longer needed to balance household expenses himself. But I said none of that aloud. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Dad always handled those details, Mom. We just do not want you blindsided. There it was again. The assumption beneath every sentence. Charles handled things. Evelyn smiled politely and arranged flowers while the men managed reality. It fascinated me how quickly people rewrite a marriage after one spouse dies. They forgot I sat beside Charles during every major decision for 4 decades. They forgot I helped him survive the recession in 1987 when we nearly lost everything. They forgot the long nights at our dining room table when I reviewed contracts beside him while Daniel slept upstairs. People only see what fits the story they want to believe. Vanessa suddenly opened another folder and slid several papers toward me. We actually took the liberty of researching current market values in this area, she explained smoothly. If you sold in spring, you could probably walk away with enough equity to live very comfortably somewhere smaller. I glanced down at the papers. Local real estate listings, condominium communities, retirement residences. One property had highlighted amenities that included water aerobics and weekly bingo nights. I folded my hands carefully in my lap before looking back at her. You researched this already? Vanessa hesitated only briefly. We were trying to prepare ahead of time. Ahead of time. Charles had not even been buried 48 hours before they started calculating square footage and resale value. Something inside me shifted then. Not anger exactly. Clarity. Cold and sharp and impossible to ignore. Daniel suddenly stood up and walked toward the kitchen sink, unable to meet my eyes anymore. "Mom," he said quietly, "Dad worried about you near the end." That caught my attention immediately. "What exactly did your father say?" Daniel turned slightly, his shoulders tense beneath his navy sweater. "He said he wanted to make sure you would be taken care of." I watched him carefully for several seconds before answering. "Your father never once worried whether I could survive without him." The room went silent again. Then I stood slowly from the table, gathered the brochures into a neat stack, and carried them to the trash can beside the pantry. Vanessa's expression tightened for the first time all morning as the glossy pages disappeared beneath coffee grounds and paper towels. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly, "but I think I need some time in this house before anyone starts planning the rest of my life for me." Daniel and Vanessa left shortly before noon, carrying the same tense politeness people use after losing an argument they thought would be easy to win. I stood at the front window and watched their SUV disappear down the long snow-covered driveway until the brake lights vanished beyond the trees. Only then did I finally exhale fully. The house became quiet again, but it was no longer the soft quiet of morning. It felt alert now, watchful, like something hidden beneath the surface had finally begun revealing itself piece by piece. I carried our coffee cups to the sink slowly, and noticed Vanessa had left her printed spreadsheets behind on the kitchen table. Estimated maintenance costs, property tax projections, suggested downsizing timelines. One line near the bottom had been circled in red ink. Luxury estate liquidation potential. Liquidation. The word sat heavily in my chest. They were already speaking about my home the way investors discuss aging retail properties. I folded the papers neatly and placed them inside a drawer instead of throwing them away. Charles taught me years ago that people reveal more truth when they think nobody is paying attention. Around 1 o'clock, my phone rang. "Martin Hale." I answered immediately. "Evelyn," he said in his calm, measured voice. "I wanted to check on you after the reception yesterday." I walked slowly into Charles's library while we spoke, running my fingers lightly across the spines of old leather-bound books lining the shelves. "I am managing," I said. Martin was quiet for a moment before asking carefully, "Has Daniel mentioned the estate yet?" I stopped beside Charles's desk. "More than once." Another silence followed. Then Martin sighed softly. Charles expected that. Those 4 words settled into the room like dust. I lowered myself slowly into the chair behind the desk, the same chair Charles occupied almost every evening after dinner while reviewing reports or pretending not to watch financial news too closely. "There is more, is there not?" I asked quietly. "Yes," Martin replied, "and I think it is time you knew everything." I closed my eyes briefly. Outside the library windows, snow continued drifting across the backyard gardens in slow white waves. "Go ahead." Martin's voice lowered slightly. "About 8 months ago, Charles requested a complete restructuring of all major assets. The trust was only part of it." I felt my pulse slow. "What else did he do?" "Every property title was transferred directly into your name. The investment accounts require only your authorization. Daniel has no controlling access to anything." I sat perfectly still. None. None. I looked down at Charles's desk and suddenly remembered how many late nights he spent in this room over the last year. At the time, I believed he was simply trying to keep busy after retirement. Now I realized he had been preparing for war quietly while pretending life was normal. Martin continued carefully. Charles was concerned about outside influence. Outside influence. Such a polite legal phrase for manipulation. "Vanessa," I said softly. Martin did not answer directly, but he did not need to. "There is one more thing," he said after another pause. "Charles left instructions regarding a family meeting." My grip tightened slightly around the phone. "What kind of meeting?" "He requested that all immediate family attend the formal reading of his private estate directives next Friday morning at my office." I stared across the library toward the framed photographs on the far wall. Daniel at his Yale graduation. Charles teaching Olivia how to sail when she was 12. Christmas mornings. Summer dinners on the back terrace. An entire lifetime captured in polished silver frames. "Did Daniel know about this meeting?" I asked. "Not yet." Martin hesitated briefly before adding. "Charles specifically instructed me not to discuss the financial structure with anyone except you until that day." A strange calm settled over me then. For the first time since Charles died, the confusion began organizing itself into something clearer. He had seen this coming long before I did. The pressure, the assumptions, the quiet attempts to reposition me inside my own life. Evelyn, Martin said gently, Charles loved you very much. My eyes drifted toward the empty leather chair across from the desk where Charles used to sit with his evening bourbon balanced carefully beside financial reports. I know, I whispered. I just did not realize he was still protecting me after he was gone. Friday morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. Hartford looked frozen beneath a thin layer of ice as I drove downtown in the black Mercedes Charles bought me for our 40th anniversary. The city streets were crowded with people hurrying beneath scarves and heavy coats. But inside the car, everything remained still and quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. I wore the pearl earrings Charles gave me the day Daniel graduated from college in a charcoal wool coat that Vanessa once described as too formal for everyday life. That morning, I wanted every piece of myself to feel exactly like the woman Charles believed I was. Martin Hale's office occupied the top floor of an old limestone building overlooking the Connecticut River. Charles always liked the place because it reminded him of old New York law firms from movies he watched growing up. Dark wood walls, brass fixtures, thick carpets that softened every footstep. When I stepped out of the elevator, Martin's assistant greeted me with a careful smile and led me toward the main conference room. I could already hear voices inside before the door opened. Vanessa's voice floated through first, polished and confident as always. I just think it makes sense to simplify things quickly before maintenance costs spiral. Daniel answered more quietly, but I could still hear the exhaustion in his tone. Let us just see what Martin says first. The room fell silent the second I entered. Vanessa straightened immediately in her chair and gave me a sympathetic smile that looked almost rehearsed. Evelyn, she said warmly, you look lovely. I thanked her politely and took my seat near the far end of the conference table without asking where anyone preferred me to sit. Sunlight filtered weakly through the tall windows behind Martin's desk, casting pale reflections across polished mahogany. On the table in front of each chair sat bottled water, legal pads, and thick cream-colored folders embossed with Hale and Associates in gold lettering. Daniel looked nervous. Not guilty exactly. Nervous. He kept adjusting the cuff of his navy blazer while avoiding direct eye contact with me for longer than a few seconds at a time. Vanessa, on the other hand, appeared composed. Prepared. She opened her folder almost immediately and began reviewing papers before the meeting even started. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten quietly. She had brought spreadsheets again. Property estimates, tax calculations, asset restructuring proposals. She was planning for this meeting the same way someone prepares for a business acquisition. At precisely 9 o'clock, Martin entered carrying a slim black portfolio under one arm. The room shifted instantly. Martin had spent nearly 30 years representing Charles, and there was a certain gravity about him that made people sit straighter without realizing it. He greeted everyone calmly before taking his seat at the head of the table. Thank you all for coming, he began evenly. Charles Whitmore left very specific instructions regarding today's meeting. Vanessa folded her hands neatly together and leaned forward slightly. We appreciate everything you are doing, Martin, she said smoothly. This has been such an overwhelming process for Evelyn. Martin glanced at her briefly but did not respond immediately. Instead, he opened the black portfolio and removed several sealed documents. Before we begin, he said carefully, I need to clarify an important misunderstanding that appears to exist regarding Charles's estate. I watched Vanessa's expression sharpen with attention. Daniel looked confused. Martin adjusted his glasses slightly before continuing. Over the last week, there have apparently been ongoing discussions concerning downsizing, financial hardship, liquidation of assets, and long-term residential planning for Mrs. Whitmore. Vanessa gave a small polite nod. Only out of concern, of course. Martin finally looked directly at her. That concern will not be necessary. Silence settled across the room immediately. I sat perfectly still while Martin opened the first document in front of him. 8 months ago, he continued calmly, Charles Whitmore completed a full transfer of controlling ownership regarding all primary assets, investment portfolios, and real estate holdings into the Evelyn Grace Whitmore Irrevocable Trust. Daniel frowned. I do not understand. What does that mean exactly? Martin folded his hands on top of the file and answered in the same steady voice he used moments earlier. It means your mother is now the sole controlling owner of assets currently valued at approximately $28,400,000. Nobody moved. Vanessa's pen slipped quietly from her fingers onto the conference table. The silence inside Martin Hale's conference room stretched so long that I could hear the faint ticking of the antique brass clock mounted beside the bookshelf near the windows. Vanessa stared at Martin as though she had misheard him entirely. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again without a word. Beside her, Daniel looked pale. Not angry, not relieved, simply stunned in the way people look when reality suddenly shifts beneath their feet. Martin remained calm. He had probably delivered life-changing information in that room hundreds of times before. There must be some mistake, Vanessa said finally, forcing a tight smile that no longer reached her eyes. Charles always handled the investments personally. Martin folded his hands neatly over the documents in front of him. He did. Until 8 months ago. Vanessa blinked rapidly. But Daniel is his only son. Correct, Martin replied evenly. And Charles loved him very much. However, the controlling ownership structure was established entirely in Mrs. Whitmore's name. I sat quietly at the end of the table, watching the room rearrange itself around information nobody expected me to possess. It was strange how quickly pity disappears once people realize you are not powerless after all. Daniel finally looked at me directly. "Mom," he said carefully, "you knew about this?" I met his eyes without raising my voice. Since the day after the funeral. His expression tightened slightly. "Why would you not tell us?" Before I could answer, Martin opened another folder. Because Charles instructed her not to. The room fell silent again. Martin removed a sealed envelope from the portfolio and placed it carefully on the table. I recognized Charles's handwriting immediately. Thick blue ink. Precise lettering. My chest tightened painfully at the sight of it. "Your husband left additional written directives," Martin explained softly. He requested they be read only after the financial disclosures were completed. Daniel stared at the envelope while Vanessa sat unnaturally still beside him. For the first time since Charles died, she looked uncertain. Martin unfolded the letter carefully and began reading aloud. "To my family, if this letter is being read, then I am no longer there to protect the people I love myself. So I have done it the only way I know how." My throat tightened instantly. Even hearing Charles's words through another man's voice felt unbearable. Martin continued, "Evelyn spent 42 years helping me build everything this family enjoys. If any of you have mistaken her kindness for weakness, that is your failure, not hers." Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the table. Daniel looked frozen. "My wife understands our finances better than anyone realizes," Martin read on. "I asked her opinion before every major investment for the last 30 years. Anyone who assumes she cannot manage without me never truly understood our marriage." I felt something shift quietly inside me then. Not triumph. Something sadder than that. Validation arriving far too late. Martin paused briefly before continuing with the final paragraph. "And to Evelyn, if they begin circling too quickly after I am gone, promise me you will not shrink yourself to make them comfortable. You were never the dependent one in this family." The room remained completely still after Martin finished reading. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly across the river while muted city traffic moved far below us. Daniel rubbed one hand across his face and stared down at the table for several seconds before speaking. "Mom," he said quietly, "I never thought you were weak." I looked at him calmly. "No, you just thought I needed permission to survive without your father." He flinched slightly at that. Vanessa finally straightened in her chair again, though the confidence from earlier had vanished entirely. "Evelyn," she began carefully, "if anything we said came across wrong, that was never our intention." I studied her face for a long moment. The sympathy was gone now. So was the gentle concern. In its place sat calculation mixed with embarrassment, the expression people wear when they realize they have badly underestimated someone standing directly in front of them. I folded my gloves neatly in my lap and answered in the same calm voice I had used all morning. "The interesting thing about grief," I said softly, "is that it teaches you exactly how people see you once they think you have nothing left to offer." 3 weeks after the meeting at Martin Hale's office, the snow finally began melting across the Whitmore estate. Thin streams of water slid down the stone pathways Charles and I used to shovel together every winter, and patches of green slowly returned to the gardens behind the house. Spring was coming whether grief was ready for it or not. I spent most mornings in the library now with a cup of coffee beside me and the windows cracked open just enough to let fresh air move through the room. The house no longer felt wrong the way it had after the funeral. Quiet, yes. Lonely sometimes, but no longer uncertain. For the first time since Charles died, I understood exactly where I stood inside my own life. Daniel called more often after the meeting, though our conversations had changed. There was caution in his voice now, not because of the money exactly, but because the illusion he carried about me had broken apart in front of him. One Sunday afternoon, he came to the house alone. No Vanessa, no spreadsheets, no retirement brochures. He stood awkwardly in the foyer, holding a bakery box from the Italian place Charles liked downtown, and looked suddenly younger than his 43 years. I should have listened to Dad more carefully, he admitted quietly while we sat in the kitchen together. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly before answering. Your father spent most of his life trying to teach people not to confuse kindness with dependence. Daniel stared down at his hands. I thought I was helping. No, I said gently. You thought control and help were the same thing. He did not argue with me. That was how I knew he finally understood at least part of the damage. Vanessa never apologized directly after the meeting. Instead, she sent flowers twice and several carefully worded text messages about misunderstandings during a difficult emotional time. I thanked her politely each time and changed nothing about the distance now sitting between us. Some relationships do not end with screaming. Sometimes they simply become clear. Martin helped me establish the Charles Whitmore Memorial Scholarship Fund that April. We arranged full tuition support for finance students at the University of Connecticut from working-class families, the kind Charles always rooted for, because he never forgot where he came from himself. The first time I signed scholarship paperwork beneath my own name instead of simply beside my husband's, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Not power, recognition, as though I had finally stepped fully into a life I spent decades quietly helping build. One evening near the beginning of May, I sat alone on the back terrace wrapped in a light sweater while the sunset turned the gardens gold and amber. The roses had started blooming again along the stone wall near the fountain Charles installed for our 25th anniversary. I could hear birds moving through the trees and the soft splash of water drifting across the yard. Inside the house, the grandfather clock chimed 7 times. For a moment, the grief returned so sharply it almost stole my breath. I missed him constantly. I missed his footsteps in the hallway, his terrible singing voice while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. The way he always reached for my hand during movies, even after 40 years together. Money could not touch that kind of absence. Nothing could. But sitting there in the quiet evening light, I realized something else too. Charles had not spent his final months protecting me because he believed I was weak. He protected me because he knew exactly how the world treats women once people think their value disappeared with their husbands. He wanted me to see the truth clearly before I surrendered my place inside it. I looked out across the estate we built together and thought about the funeral reception only weeks earlier. The pity, the whispers, the brochures slid across polished tables by people already planning where I belonged next. I almost smiled remembering it now. They thought I was a grieving widow with nothing left. What they never understood was that Charles did not leave me $28 million. He left me something far more valuable than that. He left me proof that I had never been standing in anyone's shadow to begin with.